Hi everyone, welcome, and welcome to everyone joining us online. I'm Veronica Vargas Stidvent, Executive Director of the Center for Women in Law, and I want to thank you for joining us for today's installment of our Ex Libris Series. Our Ex Libris Series hosts authors and their timely and relevant, to discuss their timely and relevant books. So we are thrilled to be joined today by Kristine Cherek to discuss her new book, Tread Loudly. And so we're really excited about that. If you are joining us online, I want to make sure you get this information as well. We have been approved for 1 hour of CLE credit by the Texas State Bar, including a half hour of ethics credit. So if you're watching us in Zoom and you're registered, you will receive an email today with the information on how to claim that credit. If you happen to be dialing in by phone, please let us know that you attended today by emailing Center for Women in Law, that's all one word, Center for Women in Law, at law.utexas.edu. And if you're here in the audience and you need that information, we'll have that number for you as well. We will save some time at the end of the program for some Q&A. So we will invite our audience to ask questions live, and we will also ask those of you joining us online to submit questions to the Q&A function in your Zoom app. For those of you who are joining us perhaps for the first time, the Center for Women in Law is a national resource for women lawyers, and we aim to generate lasting change within the legal profession. We pursue our mission in a variety of ways, including programs like today's Ex Libris Series. So we're very grateful for your support. Today's program is sponsored by Finnegan and Latham and Watkins. So we want to thank our sponsors and thank all of you for your generosity in supporting the Center for Women in Law. Every gift to the Center for Women in Law matters, and we appreciate your support. So without further ado, I want to introduce Kristine Cherek. Kristine is an attorney, former law professor, writer, and philanthropist. She began her career practicing commercial real estate at an international law firm. And by age 33, she was the general counsel of one of the nation's largest real estate development companies. She later taught property law, real estate transactions, and estates and trusts at a law school in Florida. She currently serves on multiple nonprofit boards where she advocates for arts education, equity and access in higher education, and animal welfare. Kristine earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from Marquette University and her law degree from the University of Wisconsin Law School. She's a former college cheerleader and a 6-time marathon runner, and she resides in Ponte Verde Beach, Florida, with her husband and their 2 rescue cats. So thank you so much for joining us here today. I want to learn, there's so much to talk about in this book, but I want to start where we kind of always start, which is, why did you write this and why now?
That's a great question. Well, first, I have to say thank you so much to Ronnie and to the Center for Women in Law for having me today. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I have to say, speaking to you all in this room is probably the audience I feel most comfortable and most at home with. As a lawyer, I was once a law student who sat in those very seats and who went through all the things that you all are going through, the stress of law school, the uncertainty and anxiousness of the hiring process and starting your first job. So I feel you, and it's a real passion of mine to help and do what I can to help the next generation, particularly the next generation of women, navigate their careers and kind of find their way in the professional world. So thank you all so much for having me.
Of course.
So now to answer your question. I'll start by saying I never intended to be a writer. I never thought I would write a book. It all happened very organically and maybe by necessity. As Ronnie said in that very nice introduction, I started my career at an AmLaw 100 firm at Foley & Lardner, which has offices across the country, including one here in Austin. And I knew at the time going in that it was a very male-skewed culture by numbers and leadership. This was in the late 1990s. And I thought that over time that would get better. I thought that as more women entered big law firms, that as we worked our way up in the ranks, that we'd start to see more women rise into the equity partner ranks and into positions of power. That just didn't happen as quickly or maybe at all. And I'm not at all saying anything negative about the firm I was at. It's a fantastic firm. I still have some great friends there. It was and still is largely an industry-wide problem. I then moved to a real estate development company, and now I was really the only woman in the room in a company full of architects and project managers and construction managers, and in an office of, I don't know, maybe 100 people, there was one other woman in a professional role. And so I got very used to being the only woman in the room. Went back and to law firm life, to a regional firm where I practiced, again, commercial real estate and some M&A. And again, still now 15 years later, 20 years later, just saw not as many women in positions of authority or senior level positions. Fast forward to teaching, and my students would come back from interviews, internships, or after graduation, and the stories they would tell me sounded very similar to what I experienced 20 years prior. And I thought there has to be something I can do to help. There has to be a way, rather than on a one-off basis, my students coming into my office and saying, what should I do? How do I handle this? And I thought, maybe I can say this once for all of them. And so in 2016, I started writing a blog for an organization called Miss JD, which I highly recommend to everyone in the audience. Check it out, particularly if you're a law student or an early stage career lawyer. It has a different mission than the Center for Women in Law. It's really focused on getting more women into the pipeline of law school and law firms and helping the very early stage career. And so I wrote for a year as one of their writers in residence. Did a series of posts on things that my students would often ask me about. So on that first semester, how do you overcome that total fear of being a new law student? How do you deal with final exams? And then kind of progressing, how do you deal with the interview process? What happens when you're a summer associate? And then also some broader topics about how to navigate male-dominated workplaces as a young woman. And at the time, I thought that was it. My 1 year ended, and a good friend of mine who's still practicing law at a major law firm, she said, you should write a book. And I said, that's very nice that you think I could do that, but I'm done. And now I'm going to go back to my full-time job, which I was also doing while I was writing this, and didn't really think about it again. But over the years, I think all of these thoughts had been building up in my mind and needed an outlet. So now fast forward to, this is a long answer to your question, fast forward to 2021, in the depths of the COVID lockdown. I, like lots of people, had a lot of time on my hands. I was no longer working full-time. I was doing mostly philanthropy and work for nonprofits, a lot of fundraising, a lot of event planning and galas and meetings with potential donors, and none of that was happening. So I found myself with time to spare and a need to do something with my brain and something creative. And a couple of my girlfriends told me that as well, said, you should really do something. You've got time, you've got the energy, you've got the passion. Why don't you find a way to channel all this? And the very next day, I pulled out those old blog posts and started reading and started writing and kept writing and kept writing. And the more I wrote, the more I remembered all those feelings and thoughts and relived all those experiences. And I think it just brought up 20 years of emotions and memories in me and started pouring them out into the pages, never thinking anybody would read this. It was more therapeutic, to be honest. But the more I wrote, the more I questioned and wanted to learn. So I started researching and started looking at data and thought, if my students are telling me the world doesn't feel better, I want to see if that's true. And so I started digging into the data, and the more I found, the more passionate I got. And eventually, it turned into something that resembled the length of a book. And so what started as never intending to write a book during COVID turned into, today is my book's 1-week anniversary of being for sale on the bookstore shelves. So it really just kind of came about as a culmination of my experiences and wanting to put that out into the world to do what I can to help hopefully guide and inspire the next generations.
And speaking of generations, what I thought was interesting about this book, and you mentioned it a couple times, is you are coming at this from your perspective as a Gen Xer. And there hasn't been a lot, as far as I know, in that space from the Gen X perspective. And so you're talking about really bridging that divide between the generations of women who were really true trailblazers, the first.
Yes.
And then a younger generation who says, well, now how do I navigate this because it should be better? And you talk about some of the things that you were told that you think were just not true, right?
Yes.
I was wrongly taught there was one set path to success. I was wrongly told I needed to make people forget my gender, my differences, and most of all, the fact that I had a life outside of work. I wrongly believe the fight for gender equality in the corporate world had largely been won by the generations of women who came before me. So can you talk a little bit about that? You talk about the data and you talk about the McKinsey study in your book, because I think that sort of sets the stage, because I think sometimes people think, well, one, what's the problem? Women are more than 50% of law school students. They are leaders. They are coming in ahead of their peers in terms of their accomplishments and education. And so what is the problem? And so how do you answer that?
That's a great question. So yes, as a Gen Xer, we sort of bridge this gap between, if you've ever seen Mad Men, anyone in the audience has seen the TV show Mad Men. I watched that in horror, right? Like, I can't believe this is what women went through in the workplace, the generation before me. And thought, oh, thank God all that's done. And then as I got into the workforce, yes, at the time when I entered the workforce, we were told, actually overtly at times, that you needed to blend in, that you needed to make people forget that you are female. I talk in the book about a couple of instances. We're at a closing for an M&A deal, and there are papers, we've got all the closing documents on the table, and everyone's signing and passing documents, and I see all these coffee cups, and I think, oh my gosh, somebody's gonna spill the coffee cups. So I start moving the coffee cups off the table just so nobody will spill on all of these documents. And the partner I was working for at the time pulled me aside, and he said, you need to not do that. And I said, what? I was just trying to help. And he said, don't move the coffee cups off the table. Like, don't remind people. Like, and the message I got from that was, he said, you need to just blend in here. You need to do what the guys do.
Which is just walk away
from the coffee cups. And I thought, okay, so the message is I need to do whatever I am supposed to do to blend in and make people forget I'm female. And also, why is moving coffee cups off a table a gendered thing? But the message was clear. He thought that's something girls do and not something guys do. So I needed to stop doing it. And that particular partner had guided me in several other times of things I shouldn't do. I'm too peppy. My voice is too high pitched. I answer the phone too enthusiastically. Just some things like that. And so the message was very clear that I thought I had to tone everything down. And I did. I would never have worn this dress 20 years ago because this dress stands out too much and it makes me look too female.
And it's pink.
And it's pink, and it's bright, and it's loud. So now that's kind of my thing. I've embraced all of that to reject what I was taught when I was younger. But you were exactly right. I think the danger is we think all of this is over. We think this fight for gender equality in the workplace, well, that's something that, the trailblazers before us fought that fight. And sometimes when I tell people that I wrote a book about gender equality in the workplace, sometimes the reaction I get is a kind of polite smile, like, oh, that's nice. And I've actually had a couple of people say, why? What's the problem? And so I realized that the best way to show people that there still is a problem is with data, is with numbers. We look out in the world and things feel better. They feel different. Today New Hampshire's voting, and we have a potential presidential candidate who's a woman. We have a vice president who's a woman. We have women leading Fortune 500 companies. We have women in senior positions. So it feels better, but when you dig through the data, you realize those people are the exception, that there really still is a problem, that there really still is a significant disparity in the numbers of women who are rising into positions of senior leadership in politics, in every industry across the country. So it is interesting to be this Gen X kind of middle ground, this bridge between the young people in the audience today who you've grown up in a very different world. You've grown up in a world that, frankly, is a lot more accepting than when Ronnie and I grew up. But we are the bridge between that kind of Mad Men world where women were overtly told that they couldn't do it, they weren't good enough, they shouldn't even try. And today, so we have to kind of bridge that gap as our generation, and we've walked this fine line throughout our careers of wanting to make change, of wanting to wear the pink dress, of wanting the world to be a better place, but we had to do it pretty carefully.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you point out in your book too is there's this question of when we talk about change in the workplace, is it an ask of the system, of organizations, of workplaces, of law firms to change, or is it an ask of individuals? And I think that advice has changed and continues to change. So sometimes we say the organization needs to do these things, and sometimes it's you should wear a turtleneck, and then no one will look down your blouse. And so it's those types of things, and I think there's a tension, and you addressed it in your book, and I think you can. Would you talk about that?
Sure. And that's very true. It's interesting to see the conversation evolve over time, over decades, frankly, from placing what I would call kind of the burden on the person to be different, or to not be different, I suppose, to assimilate, to play by the rules of the game, to say, women, if you just worked harder, if you did more, if you leaned in, for lack of a better word to say, there was a time where that was kind of the end of the message, that women can harness their own careers, harness their power, and really step into your power, and you can do it too, which was a great message, and it was a nice stepping stone. But now I think we can't get there alone. It's my true belief. You can't ask the person who has the cards stacked against them to make the race more fair. We need help. We need help from systems. We need help from leaders. We need help from allies. We need help from people who hold higher positions of power to help us change some of those systems so it is a more fair place. So I think it is kind of an evolution of the conversation, going from saying it's basically, women, if you just did X, Y, and Z, you can get there too, and the burden's on you to figure out how you're going to balance that and everything else in your life, to saying, yes, we need to be bold in our career and we need to dream big, and also some things need to change, some barriers need to be taken down to help us get there.
And you have some great anecdotes in your book, not only in your own life, but you talk about your friends, and they're funny, and I think in my review I said they're funny and they're sobering.
Yes.
One of the things I wanted to talk about, particularly in front of a law student audience, is this idea of, you mentioned who bears the burden, and I think that's an important ethical question too, because in a later chapter in the book you talk about what you call him the very important person.
Yes.
And I think the very important person problem is pretty prevalent. So there's a very important person. He's very important in the company, obviously, and he is well known to be a problem particularly for women. And so there's this general tips about, like, have an extra copy of your document so he doesn't have to sit close to you, to look at your screen. Make sure you try and have some, the zone of
Yes.
an extra chair and all of these things. And you talk about what you did ultimately to extract yourself from that situation. And I think particularly for new lawyers and people entering the workforce for the first time, it's hard to figure out, do I have to be the tip of the spear in terms of lodging the complaint? Am I going to put myself out there and put my career at risk, my reputation at risk? Do I do it quietly? Do I do it loudly? I mean, you're telling people to tread loudly. And so that's a really difficult needle to thread. And I think that's the question we get more often than any other from students is, what do you do when you're faced with an uncomfortable situation? In this case, probably an actionable situation. How do you manage that?
That is, well, first, it's sobering to hear that that is the question you get most often. It's very sobering to hear that. So this is proof, anecdotal proof, that the world has not suddenly become this nice place where these things don't happen. And so Ronnie, as you pointed out, there was this very senior person. I was extremely intimidated. He held a great position of power. He was the kind of client contact person for some of the biggest clients of the firm. He picked his teams of people who he wanted to work on his projects, and they tended to be far more heavily female than the demographics of the company would have lent itself to.
And in another situation, you might say, oh, well, he's mentoring women,
yes,
right?
And I actually did think that. I thought, oh, well, good for us. Whatever his motives or reasons were for picking all the young girls to be the people he worked with, good for us, because we get to learn at the hand of this brilliant person who's giving us all these opportunities. So I tried to look at the bright side and be thankful about that. But I got tired of the comments. I got tired of, walking, holding my, computer and my book in front of me. I got tired of all the just staring in places he shouldn't have been staring and all those comments. But here you are. You have, you're the junior person. You have no authority. You have no power. You're worried about your own career. You're worried about, if I say something, what are the repercussions going to be? Am I going to be labeled a troublemaker? Am I not going to be put on projects for him or his colleagues and friends? Am I essentially going to mark myself as, done? And at that point in time, I would just come home and complain to my husband incessantly, who was probably tired of hearing about it, but lent a very kind ear as I told him stories after stories. And finally, I think I just got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore. And I hope that other people don't do that. Again, one of the reasons I wrote the book, it's kind of learn from me, learn from my mistakes. And I got to the point where I thought I have two choices. My first choice is I tell somebody about this, I report this. My second choice is I just quit. And I think that's what a lot of women and it's certainly this isn't just a gender issue, it's any kind of workplace bias. It's whether it's race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender preference, any kind of bias that could exist. I think we're faced with that same decision. Do you report it? And if you do, what are the implications for your career? Or do you quietly leave? And at some point I thought, well, if I just leave, it's never going to change. It's never going to get better. And he's just going to move on to the next people. And this isn't a problem of him, by the way. There's a him.
There's him
everywhere,
in lots of places,
right?
Yeah.
Right. There's a very important person in far, far, far too many places. So it's not about that person or that place or that company at all. It's about the thread of that running through culture still today. So what do you do about it? I chose to report it, but at the time, again, things are a little different now. At the time, the company was pretty progressive. We did have an independent person who was the designated omnibuds person for the company that you could report things to. That was not in the chain of command of your department. That was outside of the management of the company. And so I did. I went and sat in her office and I just started unloading. And unfortunately, I tell the story in the book, not much happened with that. It was, I know things are tough, but when I was your age, things were so much tougher. And I had to endure all these terrible things, which I sympathized with, but also it didn't mean what I was going through was minor or unimportant. Thought, okay, I understand the baby boomers, the trailblazers who really paved the way for me to be able to sit in that seat, but now I felt like I needed to do the same for someone else. I just didn't have the confidence or position that I have today where I can do this. So I reported it and told her all the things that had been occurring and said in my presence and to me and to my female colleagues. And she was understanding, but then when I told her about this very important person, she just kind of laughed and said, "Oh, that's just him. He's harmless. Don't worry about it." And I sat there stunned and thought, okay, now what? And it was this awkward silence. And that was it. That was the end of the conversation. And that didn't solve my problem. So I realized I had to solve the problem for myself, which I shouldn't have had to do, let me be clear. But I had to kind of save myself and try to save my career, and I wasn't going to give up without a fight. And so I said, I thankfully had some contacts in another area of the company, something that I knew nothing about, something that was a bit different and a bit of a change of trajectory for me, but found sort of an ally in another place in the company and was able to work my way into saying, hey, I would be very interested in working on your team instead of the team I'm on, if you'll have me. And surprisingly, in fairly quick order, the next couple of steps happened and I was called into an even more senior person's office and ended up having to tell the story again and told this very senior person about the conversation I had with the Omnibuds person and said, here's what's happening. I've already reported this. And if I'm not allowed to kind of change teams and move to a place where I felt much more comfortable, then I'm going to quit because I can't keep doing this. And so magically, once I said I had reported this up, I did what I was supposed to do through the chain of command. Magically, somehow, that was the thing that needed to be said, and suddenly I was given the okay to move to the new place. But had I not done that, had I not somehow in me, and I am not a bold confidence person, had I not somehow found that kind of chutzpah, as my mom would say, to be that direct and say, I've reported this, I've done what I'm supposed to do, I'm not going to stay in this situation, then it never would have been approved, and I probably would have just quit. So my advice is first, tread loudly, right? It's that's the book is the title that it is. It's the subtitle is call out the bullshit, call out the bullshit, fight for equality. So my passion and what I really want anyone who's feeling the repercussions of bias or discrimination, call it out when you see it. It's easier, and if you see it happening to someone else, you're in an even better position to call it out. If you're in a meeting or a group or whatever, and someone says something to Ronnie that's inappropriate, it might be difficult for her to step at that time and say, that's not the right thing to say, but I can say, I'm sorry, what did you just say to her? Little ways we can help one another. I just caught myself. Don't say I'm sorry. There's nothing to apologize for here, and we could talk about that. Excuse me, could you repeat what you just said to her? Because I'm not sure I heard that correctly. I think I heard you say something that was not right. So in little ways, I think we can all help one another. But in big ways, when you are the person who's on the receiving end of the inappropriate comments or the bias, I wish I had a better answer. It's hard. it's hard to find the strength to go through the channels, but there's a reason why those channels exist. There's a reason why companies have whistleblower lines. There's a reason why law firms have, whether it's an ethics partner or an omnibuds person or whatever the title is, those things are put in place because by and large, companies want to know who the bad actors are. Companies don't want this to keep percolating. I don't think, I mean, if I were the CEO of a company or the managing partner of a firm, I certainly wouldn't want to know that this was happening under my watch, if for no other reason than if it's actionable. Now I'm inviting litigation into my world.
So we have hundreds of people watching online today, and so in addition to newer lawyers, we have a lot of senior folks in law firms, big and small. We have them in government. We have them all over the place and in-house. So what's your advice to them? Because their position is obviously different than a new lawyer. So we're talking about senior leadership. We're talking about entrepreneurs. We're talking about firm owners and partners and things. So how should they take on this mantle to tread loudly?
That's a great question. I'll start by saying we need the senior leaders. Absolutely. You in this room, the young people of the next generation, you can do great things and you will do great things, but you alone cannot change the system without some allies and without some people in senior leadership positions lending that ear, lending that help, and changing what is maybe not working or wrong or preventing things from being a more equitable place. So from a leadership perspective, I think it really depends on the industry, and it depends. I'll give you a couple quick examples. There are certainly concrete things that leaders can do, whether it's firm owners or company executives or anyone in a position of authority that I think are somewhat specific to industry. So let me use a law firm example to start with. Law firm example, when I worked at two different large firms, they had two very different compensation systems for equity partners. And what we're learning, and this isn't just my opinion, what we're learning from a lot of research being done by organizations like the Center for Women in Law is that things like compensation systems result in gender pay gap, result in women not being promoted maybe at the same level or at the same time frame as men. Compensation systems. So I'll just say firm A that I worked at had what they called an open compensation system, where on what we called door slam day, because everyone would get it was hard copy only, never got emailed out anywhere for obvious reasons. Every partner would get a manila envelope, and inside was a list of what every equity partner was paid that year. And it started with the highest paid person, and as the pages went on, it went to the lowest paid equity partner. And the theory with that, it certainly started long before we had a lot of these gender discussions about pay gap and gender disparity. The theory was they thought it was only fair that every partner of the company knew what everyone else made. And we called it door slam day because you'd get the envelope and you'd slam your door and you'd rip it open and want to read it. The other firm I was at had the exact opposite system. And that system, the equity partners were only told what the compensation committee was paid, 5 people. So you got your number, so end of the fiscal year, if you're not familiar with how law firm distributions work, partners are paid a salary of which at one firm I was at was actually lower than a first-year associate. So you went from a senior associate and your pay actually dropped pretty significantly when you were a first-year partner. And then at the end of the year, they divvy up the profits of the firm and you get an email saying your pay this year is X $100,000, or for some people, X $1 million, depending what firm you're at. And we were only told what the 5 people who decided everyone else's pay, we were only told what they were paid. And their theory was they thought that it would create far too much competition and animosity and questions, and they just didn't want to deal with any of it. I think there are flaws with both of those systems, but as one example of what can leaders do, really thinking about what in your company, what is happening, what are the systems that are in place. So in the first example with the open system, They, the people in power, thought, well, this is a perfectly equitable way to pay the partners. It's transparent. Anyone can look at the list and divide people, whether it's by gender or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or gender preference, whatever way you want. If you know Kristine identifies as female, so we're going to put her in this category, and you line up everybody else, you can compare pay. And they thought that made it fair and transparent. The problem was no one knew how those numbers were determined. You just got a number in both cases. There was no math, there was no review, there were no inputs. We didn't know, why was my number $50,000 more or less than last year? We called it the black box. All the data, all the information, all the feelings, thoughts, and impressions of you go into this black box, and they pull out a number, and that was our kind of joking way. So in both situations, I think there was huge room for improvement in terms of people understanding and knowing what the criteria are. And if you don't know what the criteria that you're being evaluated, whether it's for promotion or compensation, how do you position yourself? How do you look at people objectively? So pay, that is just one of many examples where I think leaders can really look at their organizations and say, what are we doing? And how is that affecting our employee base? Whether it's promotions, looking at and having the data. I keep coming back to data. Maybe it's because, so my husband's here, and I have to thank him for being here. He's a finance guy. And so he's taught me well. I went to law school because I hated math and I didn't want to deal with math. But as I live with and partnered with someone whose life revolves around data and math, I've come to love it as well. And when you look at the data, if you look at numbers don't lie, and you can use data to prove things that maybe you can sway it, but numbers don't lie. And if you look at data and you see, okay, there is either a pay gap of this or a promotion gap of that, you can say, So looking at the data, how many women are in the C-suite? How many women are in senior vice president roles? How many women are promoted beyond that first level of my company? And if I'm starting to see drop-offs, I need to dig into why. And that's a really, I think, really uncomfortable thing for leaders to have to do, to look at their companies, their policies, their systems, and figure out where the problem is. But it's a starting point.
Yeah, and when you talk about the why, in your book you talk about asking that same question of individuals, right? Mm-hmm. Because you talked about having that same sort of quarter-life crisis where you're thinking about why am I doing these things? Why am I pursuing the things I do? So do you want to address that? Because I think you're right. I think organizations need to dig into data and think why, and think about how that aligns with their mission and their processes and their practices. What should individuals, new lawyers, new workers be thinking about with their why?
That's a great question. This is something that my words of caution, I guess. People who are in this room and on this webinar are largely high-performing people. They're people who've done well in elementary school, high school, college, post-college. And I certainly fell into the pattern of wanting to do everything I was supposed to do, wanting to be the person who gets the ticket to go to the next step, gets into the good college, gets into the good law school, gets into the law firm that everybody wants to be at. And it took me a lot of years to figure out, I think I was doing a lot of that because everybody else thought it was important or everybody else wanted that. And I didn't have a good why. If someone would have said, why did you pick that company to interview with or that firm to interview with? I would have said that's the job everybody wants, so that must be the job that I want. And it took me a lot of years to be, I think, confident enough to say, I don't want that. I want a different life. And to really understand yourself and know what's important to you. Maybe it's far more important that you're able to pursue your passion in arts or pick your kids up or coach their soccer team or whatever it is, trying to resist that societal pressure to hustle, hustle, hustle and be the best and make the most money and have the biggest job and get out of that kind of hustle culture mentality. It took a long time for me to do that. And I'm telling you, it's okay. If you're in a place that you don't find fulfilling, get out, and get out fast. Don't wait years to do it. If you're in a position where you can do that, of course.
Yeah. Well, we have about 20 minutes left, so I want to make sure we have time to ask questions of folks. Folks can ask questions in the room and online. I have a list of questions that people submitted also when they registered. So first I'm going to open it up to the people in the room to see if we have any questions from folks here.
I've got a book.
Yeah, you ask a question, get a book. Okay, well let me ask you this. This was submitted online. What factors have you weighed in your decisions to either stay in or leave a toxic work culture? And you talked about the why, and you talked about some things. So what should people be thinking about when they're making those tough calls?
Sure. I think as a starting point, it's important to recognize that not everybody has the financial ability to be able to walk away from a situation. And that's obviously a gatekeeper issue. That's why I said in the last answer, if you can leave. Certainly if it's affecting your mental health, certainly if it's, I can tell you there were times in my career where I had terrible headaches, I had high blood pressure, I had stomach ulcers, I had all kinds of health problems. And once I left that situation, I didn't believe it at the time. My doctor would say, you need to go to a retreat, you need to do this, you need to do that. And I would say, no, there's a physical medical problem with me, fix it. And recognizing that those physical medical problems might just be stress embodying itself in you and telling you. So certainly if any of that is happening, that needs to be a huge red flag. And magically all of that went away. Weighing the factors, obviously, can you leave? And figuring out what is really important to you. If you're in the financial position to be able to do it, if you have the opportunity to be able to move on from a toxic situation. But really, there's a famous, well, maybe it's not famous, but it's famous in my mind, quote by Steve Jobs, where he said, at the end of every day, put a check mark or a plus or a minus. Was it a good day at work? Was it a bad day at work? And it's simple, yes or no. Thumbs up, thumbs down. You don't get to rate it. You don't get 6 different levels. And if at the end of the month or the year or whatever time frame you want, you see more minuses than pluses, then it's time to leave. That was just such a simple thing that I've kept in my mind for all these years. So it's certainly not an easy situation, but understanding what your family needs are, what your personal needs are, what your interests are, et cetera, and really following what makes you happy. Yes.
There's a question.
Thank you for coming to Thank you for coming to talk today. I was just wondering, in terms of kind of advice for, law students or new lawyers starting out, if you experience something like that in your professional life, and I don't know, you've managed to make the transition to a new position or a different place within the company, do you have any advice for kind of, I don't know, getting your confidence back after something like that? Because I know it affects all the outside stuff in your job, of course, but it also affects how you feel. So I was wondering about that.
It definitely does affect how you feel. And the best advice I have is to just, and this sounds so cliche, but to trust in yourself and believe in yourself and know that you did the right thing. It'll take a little bit of time, surrounding yourself with good people, staying away from whatever situation it was that you left. And if you're still at the same company, that might be a little bit tough. I'll tell you, when I moved to that different team, I still had to see people in the hallways, and that was really uncomfortable. And every time I would just sort of say to myself, nope, I did the right thing. I did the right thing. And as silly as it sounds, the more you make those affirmations, the more you start to believe it. And trying, and again, how do you do this? But trying not to care what other people think. It's a really hard thing in our society, but just believing in yourself and trusting yourself. And the confidence, I think, will come back as you know and trust the decisions that you make.
Hi, thank you for being here. I must say I really like your pink dress.
Thank you.
And that kind of resonated with me because prior to law school I was an engineer, so I understand being the only woman in the room. And what I'm calling my next wave of feminism is leaning into presenting myself as overtly feminist. And that's kind of a difficult transition because in the tech world, you aren't really allowed to look girly or you aren't taken seriously. So can you talk more about your physical transformation? Even though it sounds maybe trivial, I feel to me it's important because I'm I am a woman and that's okay. So thank you.
And I think that is really, I don't think it sounds silly. I think it's very true. If you would see what I wore 20 years ago, it was very different than the way I look today. I didn't have makeup on, my hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and I was just trying very hard to blend in and not look different than the guys. I see it as kind of a power thing now. And certainly, I hope that culture is a little bit different. We chose pink for the cover of the book. By the way, bright, bright, bright pink for the cover of the book, because I wanted it to evoke both things. I wanted it to be powerful and strong and bold, but I also felt really strongly that I wanted it to be pink because historically pink is associated with women. It's the baby shower gifts are pink, and breast cancer awareness, and everything in our culture historically has associated that color with female. And so I really wanted to embrace that and say, yes, you can wear the pink dresses and wear the frilly clothes and carry the cute little purse and the big high heel shoes and also be strong and bold and a leader and in a position of power. And you can do both. And I think there are some really good role models in our society who are doing that. The Barbie movie obviously comes to mind immediately, but absolutely, it's tough, especially in fields like engineering, where they are very male-dominated and you have to kind of fit in. But I absolutely say embrace it. For me personally, it was an evolution, and I thought I don't want to be different during the day than I am on a Saturday night. So this is me. If you like me, great. If you don't, and if you want to discount my intelligence or my ability just because of the way I look, that's probably going to be a problem for you, because I also have a brain in my head and I can use that brain to my advantage. And so sometimes when particularly older men would kind of treat me like oh honey, or whatever, those kind of terms, I had some dealings with some pretty condescending people in my business life. I would just kind of wait and let them think I was stupid, let them think I was not capable. And then they would never realize that in that document, I was doing some things that were really to my client's advantage that they completely overlooked because they thought I was just some dumb girl. And so I sort of embraced it and used it to my advantage. I hope you do too.
Hi. Any advice on how to network on very male-oriented corporate environments?
How to network in male-oriented environments. This is a really good question. It's something that I talk about a lot with my husband, with peers. There are companies, I think a lot more companies now than certainly even 10 years ago, have women's resource groups, have programs for women as a starting point. If you're at a firm or a company that offers those things, go to them. If not, finding women within your company or firm, I can tell you there were times where I got a knock on my door, whether I was at a law firm or a corporation or even as a professor, from someone I had never met before, and usually a very kind of timid, scared knock saying, "Do you have a few minutes?" And I would always say, "Yes, please come in and sit down." And they would talk with me and say, here's my problem, here's this. So my advice is, don't be afraid to reach out and find those people to network with, find those people. It may take knocking on a few doors or stopping at a few cubicles until you find somebody who's very receptive, but there are plenty of us out there who would love to help you and help the next generation of women.
And culturally, I'm hoping that things are making a little bit of a change in terms of, I know when I was a new associate, there was 2 opportunities. You could either golf or you could go to the spa.
Right.
And it was like the spa day was for the women lawyers and golfing was for the men lawyers. And I think people are now I'm hopeful bit more advanced in terms of like, hey, let's all go to lunch.
Right.
There's some things that organizations can do too, and you can lead the charge on those, like, hey, maybe we can all have lunch. And
yes,
that's a little more, open to everyone than
absolutely
than some other things. So.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about how to determine when it's time to leave. I wanted to ask you if you had any advice on how to leave and how to prepare for leaving in the most productive way possible.
That is a great question. I am a true believer that going out with grace will serve you well. Don't burn the house down on the way out the door. And this is my personal belief, so I'll convey that to you. You never know what your career looks like in the future. You never know what kind of contacts you have made and how those people might continue to be in your life going forward. So preparing to leave. So there's a TikTok that went pretty viral last week with a young woman who was laid off from her job, and she filmed the whole thing because she knew it was coming. I think, frankly, what she did in that snippet was pretty brilliant. She was prepared. She was composed. She asked for. Well, she was being laid off, so it's a different situation. But being armed with your reasons politely. There are plenty of people I know who left jobs and never talked. They quit because of a really bad situation and never told anyone about it. I would encourage people not to do that, because if the leaders don't know the problem, they don't know why you left, then they can't fix it. I sympathize very much with the people in charge who see this attrition and don't know why it's happening. So leaving with grace, leaving with reasons. I found this other position. I'm making the transition. I don't feel like, here are my numbers, or here's my value, or here's what I did for this company or firm. It's time for me to move on to the next thing, but I would like you to know that these are my reasons. So preparing for it is, I think, just really thinking through why it is, what is that gut feeling all about, and being able to articulate that in a graceful way, because you never know. You might leave a job, and 5 or 10 years later, that person might be on the other side of the table or at a different company, or you never know. And I just always side with being the emphatic and firm, but not burn the house down on the way out the door.
And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was about the power of a really good resignation letter.
Yes.
And because that's your opportunity to really frame what you accomplished at the company, and really make your statement in a way that you would be proud of. And think about, if that got published somewhere, would you be proud of that being published somewhere?
Yeah. So much of what we're talking about today is sort of stepping into discomfort, whether that's reporting something or just even kind of micro disruptions in a conversation, which I think a lot of us shy away from, especially early on in your career.
Absolutely.
And it can be helpful to have someone in your corner that you feel has more experience or is in a higher position of power. So I was wondering if you sought that out in your professional mentors, and if you intentionally sought out female mentorship.
That is a great question. I would say the best mentor I had in my life was male. I don't think it needs to be a gendered thing, as long as it's someone who believes in you, who advocates for you, who you trust, who gives you good advice. I certainly don't think it, so my answer is I didn't intentionally seek out female mentors at all. I looked for who was the best person who understood me and who I felt like, had my back, and that more often than not was a guy, and maybe that's because of my generation and there weren't that many women to pick from. So, it certainly is. It's difficult if you don't have a good mentor, and I'm not going to say, oh, I was lucky, I had great mentors, and I was in the right place at the right time, because I don't think that that's helpful to you. Saying, hey, I was lucky and this all clicked, is not helpful, instructive advice. So I think seeking out people who you think will advocate for you and help you is a really good thing. And again, like I said to the question earlier, there are more people out there willing to help you than you realize. There really are. We might look older and scary and sitting off to the side and not in the trenches with you, but there are so many people who really will help, and it might take asking a few to find the right fit, but don't stop trying.
Well, we have just a couple minutes left, so I want to end,
Yes.
give you the last word, and hope you'll end the way you end the book. You talk about what comes next, what now, and that you choose hope. So could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So the book ends with some really sobering statistics. And it ends with, and it seems like it's a gloom and doom message for the first few pages of the last chapter. It ends with a short discussion of the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein and all of those bad actors, and then some statistics about the lack of female CEOs in the Fortune 500. So I have to throw a little bit of data in here because I'm a data person. Only 44 of the 500 largest companies in this country are led by women. There only 6% of airline pilots are women. That one's not in the book. That's a new one I just learned the other day. Congress is tipping at the maybe 1/4 women in a country that's over 50% female. Across industries of all sizes, types, coast to coast, border to border, any position in a C-suite, so CFO, chief marketing officers, heads of HR, general counsel, from companies that are the largest in the country to companies of 50 employees, only 1 in 4 of those positions is held by a woman. So all these statistics, it's like, oh God, Kristine, you're really depressing me. But that's not the message. The message is, I choose hope. The message is, I choose to be for the next generations what I didn't see necessarily in my life. I am passionate about helping particularly younger women, but also younger men, and helping them step into their power, to be bold, to dream big, to realize you can do this, and to let you know you don't have to change who you are to achieve your goals. In fact, who you are is probably what is going to make you successful to begin with. I was far more successful in my career once I stopped pulling my hair back and started letting myself wear makeup to work and felt comfortable and confident in who I am. And what makes you different is what makes you special. And so the I choose hope message is, I choose hope for the next generation. I am so inspired by millennials and Gen Z. I have 7 nieces who range in age from 18 to 33, and I'm so inspired by them, by how fearless they are, and I choose hope for the next generation. I choose hope for the future of our country because I think the world can and should be a better place. So instead of pulling the shades and crawling into bed and saying, oh my God, this is all terrible and all these statistics are just awful for how far women have or have not come, the truth is we can all help fight. We can all advocate for one another and stand up for one another and empower each other. And together, collectively, helps us individually believe in ourselves. I find that the easiest thing for me to do is to champion the accomplishments of my friends. So my social media is filled with every time I go to a particular sports arena, I take pictures of this arena and I post it on my social media because a very good friend of mine was one of the lead designers of that arena. Championing the successes of other women is the easiest thing to do, and it helps inspire me every day to realize that we all have this in us. And my friends do it for me, my colleagues and coworkers do it for me, I do it for them, and we lift each other up. And I think that's really the key to the future. There are as many seats at the table as we want. We can all be there together. And that's why I end the book with the I Choose Hope.
Thank you so much to Kristine Cherek. The book is Tread Loudly. I want to thank all of you for joining us both in the room and online today. Thank you to Finnegan and Latham & Watkins for sponsoring this event. Just a reminder that this has been approved for CLE credit. You'll get an email today if you're watching online, or you can email us at the center to claim that credit. Thank you all so much, and I hope you will follow the Center for Women in Law on our social media and watch for our newsletters and emails, and I hope to see you all at our next event. Thank you so much.
Can I say one last thing?
Yes.
One last thing. Sorry, speaking of social media, if you had a question in the audience or a question in the chat that didn't get answered, just message me. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook if you use Facebook. You can find me on Threads, which I know not a lot of people use. And I have some bookmarks at the front of the room. It has all my social media handles on there. Or you can just look for Tread Loudly or my name. I'm happy to answer any questions that didn't get answered. And I just want to say thank you to Ronnie, to the center, to all of you for watching online, for being here in person. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Kristine. Really appreciate it.